is the first one is bounded buffer problem, or we also call it as producer consumer problem. Okay, and then we have two more examples. Second one is readers writers problem, and the third one is we call it as dining philosophers. Okay, these are common problems associated with process synchronization. So the first one is bounded buffer problem or producer consumer problem. So here this producer consumer problem is nothing but we are trying to synchronize the working of a producer and a consumer that is using a common buffer. So here your common buffer is going to act your critical section part. So as we know that when we have a critical section part, only one process can use the critical section at a time. So whenever we are talking about this producer consumer problem, the buffer which acts as a critical section part can be used by the producer. Then once it is free, then only consumer can use it. So here we're trying to make sure that whenever the buffer is being used by either producer or by consumer, then the other one should not use it. Okay. So just a second. Okay, just a second.
Recording in progress.
So in this producer consumer problem, we are going to see that the critical section part, that is your buffer, should be used by the producer or your consumer only at a time. So once it is used by producer, then the consumer has to wait, and when the consumer is using, your producer has to wait. Okay. So the problem can be solved by using semaphore. Okay, we have seen that what is a semaphore. So a semaphore is nothing but an integer variable where you are going to have two operations, wait and signal operation. Okay, so using the semaphore, we can solve this problem of producer consumer. Okay, so there are a few common data structure that is going to be shared among the producer and the consumer. Okay, so your producer and the consumer is going to share some variable, that is some variable number n, where it represents the number of slot in your buffer. Then you'll have some semaphore mutex, meaning that mutual exclusive variable. So you're going to have a variable for mutual exclusive, then you are going to have a variable empty to signify whether the buffer is empty or not, then you'll have another one as full, which can identify whether the buffer has been used fully or not. Okay, so let's see about this producer consumer problem. Okay, I'll just share another producer consumer problem. So when we're talking about this producer consumer problem and we're trying to solve it using semaphore, so the first question is, what is a semaphore? So a semaphore S is an integer variable that can be accessed only through two standard operation, wait and signal. Okay, so this semaphore is an integer variable where you are going to have two operations, that is wait and signals. So what does wait do? Your wait operation reduces the value of your semaphore by 1. Okay, your wait operation is going to reduce the semaphore value by 1, whereas your signal operation is going to increase its value by 1. Okay, like wait is doing the decrement operation of the value, whereas your signal is carrying out like the increment of the variable. Okay, so let's see how this problem statement of this producer consumer look like. So here we are going to have a buffer of fixed size. So as I just mentioned n number, so we assume that n, okay, some fixed size. So we have a buffer of fixed size, and then a producer can produce an item and can place it in the buffer. Okay, and the consumer can pick item and consume them from the same buffer. So you'll have a buffer where it will have many slots. Okay, so the producer will produce and keep the item, and the consumer will pick up item from there. Okay, so we need to ensure that when a producer is placing an item in the buffer, at the same time it should not consume any item. So meaning that your buffer is acting as your critical section part. So if the producer is using it, the consumer cannot use it. So here, so in this problem, your buffer is acting as the critical section part. Okay, to solve this problem, we need two counting semaphores. So we have used two semaphores that is full to keep track of number of items in the buffer at any given time, and empty to keep track of number of unoccupied slots. So whenever you have this full, it keeps the number of items that is filled in the slot of the buffer. Okay, and your empty is going to keep track of the number of your unoccupied or free slot in the buffer. Okay, so there, so the few variable that is going to be shared among the producer and consumer, as I said, there is going to be mutex. That is, this is a semaphore for mutual exclusive to the buffer pole. Okay, it has to be initially initialized to 1. Then you'll have your empty semaphore, which is going to count your empty slots of the buffer, which is initially initialized to n, where n is nothing but the size of the buffer. Okay, the size of the buffer, the fixed size that we have assumed. Okay, then you'll have here this full semaphore to count the fill buffer slots. Okay, so the point is, the first one is your mutual exclusive semaphore has to be initialized to 1. Then your full has to be initialized to 0, as initially there will be no slot that will be filled up. Means all slots are empty, so it will be 0. And n is an empty, there will be all those slots will be empty. So considering that the slot of the buffer is n, then we have to initialize the empty slot as n. Okay, so for the solution of it, the producer, the first it has to produce an empty, then it has to carry out the wait operation on the empty variable, then it has to carry out the wait operation on the mutual exclusive variable. Then once it's done, then it is going to use the critical section that is placed in buffer. So whenever we use this one, it makes sure that this wait operation of empty and mutual exclusive makes sure that it allows the producer to use the critical section that is your buffer, and making sure that the consumer is not allowed to enter it. Okay, so whenever we use this wait operation, what we're going to do, we're going to decrement the value of your variable empty as well as mutual exclusive variable. Okay, so once we are done with this critical section, that is placing the item in the buffer, then we have to come out of that, and we are going to just carry out this signal operation on both mutual exclusive variable. Then we are going to carry out signal operation of full. Means whenever we are carrying out this operation, one operation, we are just filling up one slot in the buffer. So the full before will be 0, but once it is being used by the producer, one slot has been full. So your full will be incremented by 1. Okay, so this is how it works. Okay, so how it works, even it is mentioned here. So when the producer produces an item, then the value of empty is reduced by 1. Okay, because one slot will be filled now, so the value of your mutual exclusive, that is mutex, is also reduced to prevent the region is over here, to prevent the consumer to access the buffer, as this buffer is your critical section and it has to be allowed by only one process at a time. So your access to the buffer will be blocked by this operation. So now once the producer has placed the item, then the value of your full, that is the value of full, is going to be increased by 1 as we have filled up one slot of the buffer by an item. Okay, and the value of mutex is also increased by 1 because the task of the producer has completed, and now your critical section is free and the consumer can access the buffer now. Okay, so this is the concept which will add solution for your producer. And then for consumer, it's also almost same, but only the thing is here, when you look to previous one, wait operation of full will carry out. So right, whenever we are talking about consumer, we are going to take some item out of the fill slot, so we are going to decrement the full. Okay, and whenever we are talking about consumer, then we're going to just carry it out wait operation on full, and then as usual, then we'll have wait operation on mutex. Okay, so then we will remove the item from the buffer. Once it is done, we will give a signal to the mutex incrementing the value, and then we will give signal to the empty variable as well, as one value has been removed, so the number of slot of empty slots is increased by 1. Okay, so by this manner we can solve this problem of producer consumer. Okay, so here also it is being mentioned. So as the consumer is removing an item from buffer, therefore the value of your full is going to be decreased by 1, as we have removed one slot of item from the buffer, and the value of the mutex is also reduced, just like same as the previous case, as whenever your mutex variable has been reduced, it makes sure that the other process is not allowed to enter the critical path. So in this case, when we are talking about this consumer, whenever your consumer is using the buffer, so we make sure that the producer cannot use the buffer at the same time. So once your producer has consumed the item, then we are going to increase the value of empty by 1, as we have empty one more slot, and then the value of mutex will also be increased, so that now it indicates that your buffer is free, it can be used by the producer. Okay. So this is the concept of this producer consumer problem. Okay. So while implementing it, you may have like different system calls that is available with the system. So like we have SEMoff, that is semaphore operation. Then we have SEMctl to indicate semaphore control operations. Then you have SEMget, get a semaphore set identifier. Okay. So like while implementing the program for this problem, you may use different system calls. Okay. You can just go through that also. So now the first question is, are everyone understanding what this producer consumer problem refers to? Anyone, do you have any doubt? Because you are going to have a lab program on this today. Anyone, do you at least understand what this producer consumer problem refers to? So let me repeat once again. So your producer consumer problem is nothing but the problem of process synchronization, where a process can use the critical section only at a time. Okay, here we're trying to solve it using semaphore. So your semaphore is nothing but a integer variable that have two operations, that is wait and signal variable, signal operation, where wait carries out the decrement of the variable, where signal carries out the increment of the variable value. Okay, so in this producer consumer problem, we make sure that either it is producer or either it is consumer, both of cannot use the critical section at the same time. We make sure that only one of the process, that is either producer process or the consumer process, must use the critical section at a time. So, and the critical section in this question or in this scenario is nothing but the buffer. Okay, so, and here buffer is nothing but our memory location. So so when we are considering about this memory location, we are going to consider a fixed memory locations. So we may have a number of, we consider like in the question while implementing, we consider a number of slots are present in this buffer. Okay, so for this n number of slots, it will be initially empty. So initially, all the n slots of the buffer is going to be empty. So, and we are going to have a few more variables being shared. That is, number one is mutex, that is semaphore for mutual exclusive to access the buffer pool. So this mutex is responsible for making sure that only one process is able to use the critical section part at the time. Okay, then you'll have empty variable. So your empty variable counts the number of empty slots in the buffer. So initially, when we are working out, initially all the slots are empty. So n number of slot are empty. So initially we are going to initialize with n, and for full it has to be initialized to 0 initially, as all the slots are empty. Okay, so these are the points that has to be known, and these are the operation that is being carried out. Okay. Okay, here is the file that I'll share this one. So here it is also explain the same concept again. Here it is also given all the programs. Okay, and here you may find some system called functions. Okay, so I have just mentioned all those few of the function. You can even go through it to the website also, and Google it from and get it in a unique system calls. Okay, so here this is the program. I'll be just sharing it to you. So this was your bounded buffer problem or your producer consumer problem. Okay, so similarly we have this readers writers problem. Here also same thing. Here also, like, you will have a critical section part where you have to process, as the process in this case are readers and writers, and only one of them can use the critical section part at a time. So when the reader is using the file or using the critical section part, the writer cannot use it. Similarly, when the writer is using the critical section part, your reader cannot use it. Okay, so this is similarly. So similarly, even this one also the same thing. You can just go through it. Okay. Okay, I will share the files now. You just go through it and just try whether you can run the program in the lab today. And this class will be automatically ended within 5 minutes. So just give your attendance in the chat box, and if you have anything about producer consumer problem, just tell me.